This week marks the first 100 days of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. What do these first months tell us about what's to come? Here with analysis of this and much more, Papal Posse, Father Gerald Murray and Robert Royal. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. August 16th marks the 100 days of Leo's reign as Pope. It's also my daughter Mariela's birthday. Happy birthday, honey. We were in Rome for the election of the Pope, and Father, when we first saw him appear at St. Peter's on that balcony, Leo struck a visual cue that he was seen wearing the papal mozzetta, the traditional red cape. Have you seen ongoing evidence of a move, a tilt toward the traditional?
Well, Pope Leo has certainly brought calm and dignity and sort of the whole aura that goes with the pontifical protocols that he has restored. Pope Francis, of course, was very much simplicity and didn't really like all of the pontifical ways of doing things. So that aspect, Pope Leo has restored what I think people have come to expect in the media age, which is that the Pope is going to present an image of Catholicism that is grounded in, historical ways of doing things. He's also given, I think, a very calm and measured and spiritual attitude in dealing with the faithful, because he's not doing all these multiple interviews making controversial statements. He had a beautiful homily to young people when they had the World Youth Gathering at Tor Vergata outside of Rome. He's given wonderful homilies and talks to different groups. So I think what we're seeing in the first 100 days is a man who is reflective, meditative, and is conscious that he occupies an office, a successor of Peter, that goes beyond him. And therefore, he's going to respect protocols which are designed to heighten the dignity of the office and let the man, in a certain sense, be subsumed in what he is, the successor of Peter.
Yeah, Bob, the most glaring break from the past is the fact that Leo is the first American-born pope in the history of the church and a native English speaker, which still kind of throws me a little bit, when you see the Pope break out in fluent English, in addition to Spanish and Italian. Your thoughts on the meaning of his Americanness and how that has transformed, if you will, the public face of the papacy?
Well, it's a little hard to say at this point. I mean, it's only 100 days, and it's the nature of the church that things don't turn around overnight. As much as some of us would like to see certain things like the traditional Latin Mass restored and whatnot. But I think Father has put his finger on the important part. I mean, in a way, he's almost sort of the antithesis to John Paul II, who was this big public figure and charismatic, and he was an actor, and yet there's a thing about Leo that he's his own man. He's quietly kind of attractive, and in a funny way, in the world that we're existing in right now, that kind of quietness and recollectedness is something unusual. And maybe there's something in his American background that he said very early on. Remember, he said the church has to get away from being a spectacle and to be something that is deeper and more authentic. And so maybe his American experience at the way that everybody is looking for clicks online and media and hoopla, he may actually be reacting to that and presenting kind of a different but very attractive kind of public face of the papacy.
Yeah, there's a gentle serenity about him that he carries with him. And you're right, it's not the grand gestures of John Paul II, but there's something very gentle and refined about him almost that is refreshing. Look, even Madonna this week wanted him to speak out on Gaza. We talked about this over on the Prayerful Posse. And she referred to him as please bring your light to the people of Gaza. If Madonna's saying he's got light, the guy's attractive and winning over converts here. In his first public address, moments after his election, Pope Leo said the following: "We want to be a synodal church, a church that moves forward, a church that always seeks peace, that always seeks charity, that always seeks to be close above all to those who are suffering." Father, we've talked a lot about synodality, God knows, ever since that Amazonian synod. Later, Pope Francis's synod on synodality. What were your thoughts upon hearing those words following the election? And how do you think Leo will manage this synodality going forward?
Yes, well, I think he mentioned synodality precisely because that was the theme that Pope Francis adopted for his pontificate, that he wanted something called a synodal church in contradistinction to the way the church had presented herself up to his pontificate. It's really not clear, though, what synodality means. We know that for Pope Francis, it meant elements including having lay people at a meeting of bishops and having an equal vote with bishops about resolutions that would be presented at the end of the synodal assembly. This is a radical break with the nature of the Synod of Bishops, which was established by the Second Vatican Council and then implemented by Pope Paul VI, now St. Paul VI. Certainly, this is a big question mark. How does Pope Leo understand synodality? Does it mean shared governance of the church? Because that's what's implied when you have lay people voting equally with bishops at a meeting that is concerning the governance and teaching mission of the church. I hope not, because that would be a denial of the hierarchical nature of the church. We always have to remember the fact the Catholic Church is not a human organization that the apostles got together and decided what to do. It was founded by Christ upon the apostles, and he told them, feed my sheep. They're the ones who are leading the flock. So if Pope Leo gets back to a more traditional understanding of the nature of the hierarchical church, then synodality can be properly interpreted as a way of gaining information and advice.
Bob, are there any indicators of where he's headed with the Synod? I saw one report where they said in some official proclamation that he had stricken Synod of bishops. He'd taken the bishops part out, and it just said, you know, a Synod gathering or something. Do we have any indications of where he's headed with this?
Well, I think that would be an improvement, because at least then we wouldn't be pretending that we're doing the same sort of thing that Paul VI had actually set up to.
Right.
If you want advice from everybody, fine, you can do that, but don't call it the Synod of Bishops. It's something quite different. I think this is going to be one of the hallmarks of his papacy, how he handles this question of synodality, because, as Father rightly says, you can't really tell what it is, because the documents seem to be deliberately obfuscation. And it's like, you don't have to take the papal posse's word about this. All you need to do is to pick up a document that's been published by the officials that are running the synod, and you'll see that, you know, no high school English teacher would accept this type of writing. It's all over the place. It has these big words that point in, you know, all kinds of different directions. I think the best thing that he could do would be to introduce some clarity. Then at least we would know what we're dealing with when we talk about synodality. I've said this before, but I think that this is another important element in his approach to synodality, is that I think he's the type of man who doesn't like abrupt changes, and at the same time he feels a certain loyalty to Pope Francis. So it may be a kind of a change within continuity if he may continue to use the term, but if he uses the term in a way that actually is helpful, as opposed to what the Synod seemed to have turned into, which is a very inward-looking, almost kind of bureaucratic approach to what the church is. And this is ironic, because it was set up to make the church seem to be welcoming and evangelizing. He's got a steep climb ahead of him if he wants to preserve that term, to turn it into something that is truly in the service of evangelization of the world.
Yeah. Leo's made a number of official acts and pronouncements in the early days of this pontificate. He met with Cardinal Angelo Becciu, the figure at the center of the Vatican's financial scandal. He appointed a Franciscan sister of the poor as secretary of the Dicastery for Institutes of Consecrated Life. He replaced controversial Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia as the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life. And he's bestowed the pallium on 54 new metropolitan archbishops, including 8 from the U.S. Leo's about to declare St. John Henry Newman a doctor of the Universal Church. Father, your thoughts on the official actions Pope Leo has taken so far. What do they tell us about the man and how he might govern in a pontificate that could last for 15 to 20 years or more?
Well, I think naming the sister to the Roman Curia position of secretary of the Dicastery for what used to be called religious, it's now consecrated life, That's a significant thing because it indicates that he is of the canonical mind that governance in the church, because the secretary of a dicastery exercises governance as part of the office, that lay people and religious can exercise governance in the church. Now, I think this is a mistake, and I don't think it should hold, but he apparently doesn't share that view. So that's going to be something to see where it goes, because if a layperson or a nun can be the number 2 at a congregation, why not make them number 1 in the sense of being equal to what is now roles carried out by bishops and cardinals? So this has got to be dealt with. I think canonically there has to be a justification that's consistent with the theology and doctrine. As regards other acts, I think most of the important acts have not happened yet. He's got to name the permanent replacements for all of the dicastery heads that Pope Francis had named. And as the old saying, personalis policy, is Cardinal Fernandez still going to be head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith? That'll be a key appointment in my opinion, because if there's one cardinal in the Curia that represents Pope Francis's more radical thinking, particularly on the question of communion for divorced and remarried and the blessing of gay couples, that would be Cardinal Fernandez, because he was the author of both of those documents that Pope Francis approved. So that's where we're going to see things. And then, we have all these bishops in the United States who are at retirement age or reaching it. Where is he going to turn for their replacements? So a lot remains to be seen. I don't think we can definitively say anything right now about the direction that Pope Leo is taking the church.
Bob, you mentioned that point earlier, and it's so important before we started, that we have so many openings here in the United States of major sees. How will those appointments tell us? What will they tell us about this papacy and who this man is, Pope Leo?
Yeah, I think for most people, what goes on in the Vatican is sort of like inside baseball. So it's hard for them to follow who's who and who's up, who's down, what the importance of certain offices are. But I think for most of our audience, it's going to be quite clear for the appointments that he makes as some major sees. I mean, for example, New York, Chicago, these now have cardinals that are both past retirement age, and he's an American. We were talking about that earlier, but he's an American, and you can't use an excuse, or you can't avoid the fact that he knows from his own personal experience what it's like to be an American and what certain appointments mean in the United States. Now, he spent a lot of time abroad. He's a fluent speaker of Spanish. He knows Latin America. He knows Rome. But as an American, I think we're going to have to look very carefully for what he begins to do, not only with New York and Chicago, but there are sees like Philadelphia, where you haven't had a cardinal in Philadelphia. There hasn't been a cardinal recently in Baltimore, which was the primatial see in the United States. And for some reason, Pope Francis just thought that it wasn't important to have a cardinal in what was the only see for a long time in the United States. I think Archbishop Gomez out in Los Angeles should be a cardinal. It's the largest diocese in the world. So these are going to be some very important things that we as Americans are going to be able to look to, and I think really begin to take the measure of how he's parsing out where the church ought to go.
Yeah. Father, Pope Leo spoke early on about the liturgy. This was on May 15th. He addressed Eastern rites in the Catholic Church, and he said the contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have a great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. Father, the liturgy wars were really inflamed, we have to say it, by Pope Francis's abrogation of Benedict's liberation of the traditional Latin Mass, putting harsh restrictions on that Mass via Guardians of Tradition, that document. Immediately that came to mind when I read those words. Your thoughts on what Leo might do regarding the liturgy, particularly in light of the recent controversies in Detroit and North Carolina, with bishops clamping down, again citing Pope Francis?
Well, I was very appreciative of what Pope Leo did say about the nature of the divine worship in the Eastern Christian world, because it's precisely the mystery and awe of heaven and God, the angels and the saints, this holy sacrifice. All of that is highlighted by the beauty of the church, the chanting, the incense, the iconography. The Eastern liturgy is celebrated ad orientem almost universally. So the remarks that he made, by the way, he could equally have read those same remarks to a group of traditional Latin Mass Catholics if they were in Rome on a pilgrimage, and everything he said about the beauty of the Eastern would have applied to the beauty of the traditional Latin Mass. Now recall that Pope Benedict said he wanted mutual enrichment between the traditional Latin Mass and the New Order Mass, the Novus Ordo. That's what we have to strive for. We do not need Mass as an entertainment and talk show format in which people have an opportunity to express what's on their mind. We need people walking into church saying, this is the antechamber of heaven. This is the place where God comes down on the altar in order to give me his life. And it's a place where I have my sins brought before God and mercifully forgiven in the sacrament of penance, and then I receive communion worthily. That's what divine worship's all about, and it should be equally evident in both East and West.
Well, I love that idea of it, and he said it. It engages the entire person, the entirety of the senses, in a way that some of these modern liturgies certainly just don't measure up. Bob, I have to talk about this. Pope Leo, he's spoken forcefully in his first 100 days about international and geopolitical matters. He's appealed for peace in Ukraine, in Gaza. He's urged the return of the hostages in Gaza and access to aid, demanded ceasefires. He's spoken with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and Russian President Putin. He's also commented on the Holy Spirit's role in opening borders in relationships with others, which many saw as a commentary of the situation at the southern border here in the U.S. Your thoughts on how Leo has conducted Vatican foreign policy, if you will, and how do you think it's perceived by the world's leaders?
Well, like his other activities, I don't see him as grandstanding with these things. I see him as acting as the kind of universal shepherd, calling for peace where it's possible, knowing that it's difficult to get parties that are already at war to come to some kind of agreement together. And I mean, I like that approach. I think he should be extremely careful, though, about the way he enters into these things, because the church's authority in public affairs only goes so far as moral matters are concerned. It has no special insight into what ought to happen in Gaza. You know, we've got the president of the United States and the president of Russia meeting in a few days. He has no particular insight about what to do about that. It's good to remind people that we should find some other ways to resolve questions, but you don't put the church's authority on the line by going too far with that. I'm kind of interested in what we just talked about with this kind of mystical side of him. That when he was writing his dissertation at the Angelicum, he wrote about obedience and authority in the church. And so I think he's got at least two main strings in the bow, that he's got that kind of depth to him. And he's also got this sense of institutions, that you know, there has to be subordination and leadership. And he brings all of that to these different circumstances that he's in. And he brings it with that kind of Augustinian passion. People often talk about the difference between Aquinas, say, and Augustine. Aquinas gives you these very logical presentations of things, whereas Augustine, his heart is always on his sleeve, and he's talking to you, but he's talking to you about God, about the truths of God, and about love. So I'm hoping all those elements can kind of come together in his public presentation of himself and of the church.
Yeah. Gents, I want to talk about Pope Leo's, and that's a good transition, his pastoral approach, and contrast it with Pope Francis. Leo does have a certain gentleness, which we've talked about. It is winning, I think, people even outside of Catholicism over. And a recent example was a visit the Pope made to console a Spanish teen who had been hospitalized during that Jubilee for Youth earlier this month. The 15-year-old boy is stricken with severe lymphoma. And Leo made an unannounced visit to the Bambino Gesù clinic. He prayed with the boy and his family. Father, your thoughts on the gentle, quiet, unassuming character of Pope Leo? As Bob said, he's not a show dog.
No, this is a very attractive and impressive aspect of his approach, and it reminds you of the classic attitude that bishops try to take, which is that they are the spiritual father of those who come before them. So that's their primary job, is to help them to come to know and love God better. And certainly visiting the sick, one of the corporal works of mercy, it's a beautiful testimony to the divine interest that God has in the sick, and certainly we show that ourselves. I'm very impressed when I see, for instance, at the general audience afterwards in Rome, if there was a group, for instance, of Peruvian nuns who came to see him, and he took the time to greet them and to speak with them. He had Yannick Sinner, the tennis champion Italian, came to visit him and gave him a tennis racket, because we know the Pope plays tennis. These are not unimportant things, and they really display that he is not a bureaucrat. He's not hiding from people. That's a great model for all bishops and priests. We have to be very available to the people, but to do so in a way we're not drawing attention to ourselves, but rather, why am I here? Because God sent me to you.
Bob, before we run out of time, your greatest hope and the greatest challenge you feel Pope Leo will face during this reign as pontiff?
Well, I've been saying for a long time that we don't really need any novel teaching in the church. I think, if you look back at the long papacy of Francis, many of the innovations that he tried, that he thought would be reaching out to people, actually, it not only didn't reach out to people, it caused further division within the church. You can only judge those initiatives by the results that they actually have. Leo's talked about bringing people together, and he talks about it in a way that is quite believable. I think at this point we would already have heard backstories about, how he says one thing and does another, and there are factions that oppose. Everyone that he meets seems to like him. They say he listens to you. He's kind of gentle. He's open to what you're talking about, and you try to work out some things with him. Pope Benedict was that way too, but I think that Benedict was weaker on the administrative side. And I would hope, my greatest hope would be that Leo could combine that personal style that he has with a solid governing of the church, bringing people together, teaching people to learn about the gospel, follow it in their lives. That's what the church is all about. That's the thing we judge its successes and its failures by how many people it brings to belief in Jesus and following his way. Everything else, in a way, is kind of negligible. Yeah.
Father, greatest challenge Pope Leo faces, your greatest hope for the pontificate?
Yeah, the challenge he faces is to restore the church's positive and enthusiastic affirmation of the doctrine of the faith. And this will require that he correct errors that were taught regarding, for instance, communion being given to divorced and remarried people and the blessing of homosexual couples. We cannot say we're going to teach the gospel and then present things which contradict the gospel. And these are not matters of opinion. No pope ever in the history of the church taught that someone in an objective state of adultery should be given Holy Communion. And no pope ever taught that two people who are in a sexual relationship of the same sex deserve a church blessing. So I think this is a big challenge, because naturally people can say, oh, you can't offend Pope Francis's legacy. And the answer is, we're not here as the Church of Pope Francis. We're here as the Church of Jesus Christ. And he needs the courage of St. Peter to say, Lord, I want to teach what you taught, and I'm going to do that even if some people aren't happy. And the hope, of course, is always God is in charge, and it's his divine providence which guides the church over the shoals of controversy and upsetness. And when people object to the defense of the faith, we simply have to say, okay, say what you want, I'm going to be calm, and the rest of the church is going to do what we've always done. We believe in the gospel, and we affirm it. We don't try to trim, chop, and redo it.
Yeah, no, there's a huge opportunity here. Before I go, we addressed this actually 2 weeks ago on the Prayerful Posse, that breaking Vatican scandal, where you had Libero Milone, who was the former chief auditor of the Vatican. He was forced out in 2017. We've covered the story about basically they were hiding and changing the names and account numbers on transactions after they had been made in order to hide the identity of recipients and senders. So, Bob, it looks like it was a way to launder cash. We get into it on that podcast. That was 2 weeks ago. But very quickly, Meloni has asked to meet with the Pope. Do you think he'll get that meeting?
I hope so. I have a feeling that Leo is the kind of guy who will listen to anybody who has a legitimate claim to make to him. Mm-hmm. Whether the powers that be around him will prevent that from happening, I don't know. I mean, even some of our powerful popes, like John Paul II, were unable to resist some people in the Curia. So let's pray that he gets that opportunity.
Father, he is saying, Meloni is saying, you are surrounded by men who are not telling you the truth. I need to meet with you. And just so people know, Libero Meloni, he ran Deloitte for Europe. I mean, this is not an insignificant figure. He was the CEO of Deloitte. Your final word.
Yeah, no, it's in the interest of the Holy See that outstanding questions regarding dishonest financial activities be resolved. And the trial did not result in that because, of course, Cardinal Betchou is now on appeal. He's a free man, even though he was sentenced. And many aspects of the corruption in the Vatican have yet to be revealed. No, it's everybody's interest that the governing organization of the Catholic Church be above suspicion as regarding its handling of money, property, and assets. And if what Meloni says happened, that money laundering was being facilitated by people who were dishonestly changing codes within an international banking system, then we have to know, is that charge true or not? And if it's true, anyone who did it needs to be fired. And anyone who was silent about it also needs to be given a new job. And we have to have a whole new set of people in there. You don't reform an institution by simply saying, from now on, people are going to act better. That doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, I think we have the challenge. Once again, the challenge for the Pope presents itself. Reaffirm doctrine, clarify what has been distorted, and fix the Curia, fix the institution itself and restore it to credibility. All of that is needed. Gentlemen, we could go on for another hour. For commentary from Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, you can visit thecatholicthing.org. And don't miss the Prayerful Posse dropping Friday on the Arroyo Grande Show YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. We got into this entire financial matter about 2 weeks ago, and we've got more hot takes this week. Check that out. Thank you, gents.